Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. We're diving into another set of topics today, April 4th, 2025, Part 2, specifically for anyone gearing up for the UPSC exams. And hey, you might notice some familiar themes from past deep dives. Consider it a bonus revision session built right in. If you're finding these deep dives useful for your prep, we'd love it if you'd hit that like button and subscribe for more.
Right on. Today, we're going deep on some pretty major updates across different sectors, all super relevant if you're on that UPSC path. We'll be untangling the India-Australia trade deal, looking closely at the Green Credit Program, and really getting into the Supreme Court's take on the anti-defection law, plus the changes to the Waqf Act.
And that's not even all of it. We're also going to unpack child adoption in India, break down that new immigration and foreigners bill, and check out what NTI Aayog's Fiscal Health Index tells us about the states. Oh, and we'll touch on the anniversary of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj and the role women play in disaster risk reduction, plus get you up to speed on India's steel procurement policy and, well, some surprising tariff news about Heard and McDonald Island. Stay tuned for that.
Exactly. And we've got even more the recent arrest connected to the Sentinelese people, the idea of repurposing the National Polio Surveillance Project, and the discovery of some cool copper plates from Darius's reign. Our goal here, as always, is to cut through the noise and deliver the core insights you need for your UPSC prep. Saves you time and gives you that solid understanding of what's happening. So, ready to kick things off with how India and Australia are linking up economically?
Let's do it. So it's been 3 years since India and Australia inked that Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement, the IA-ECTA, and it's been a pretty big deal. Bilateral trade hit 24 billion USD in 2023-24, right after it kicked in back in 2022. What really stands out and what you want to note for your UPSC prep is that our exports to Australia shot up by 14% compared to the year before. That kind of jump really hints at India becoming more competitive on the global stage.
The raw numbers are important, no doubt, but what's even more interesting is what this IA-ECTA says about strategy. You see, it's not just about more trade, it's also about building some resilience into India's economic approach, especially in a world that feels, well, kind of unpredictable. It's about having more options and not relying too heavily on any single trade route.
Like spreading the risk, right? Smart move. Okay, UPSC folks, let's dive into the specifics of this IA-ECTA. A big part of it is getting rid of tariffs. Australia's on board with dropping tariffs on 85% of their stuff coming into India, and we're doing the same for 96% of what we send their way. That two-way street opens up opportunities for industries on both sides.
Absolutely. And to make sure this deal benefits India and Australia and not just random countries trying to sneak in, they've got these tight rules of origin. Basically, these rules lay down the law on how much processing or value adding needs to happen within either India or Australia for a product to get those sweet tariff cuts. No free rides.
Makes total sense. Keeps things fair. Then you've got trade-in services, which is becoming, well, a huge part of how economies work these days. Australia's opened up 135 subsectors for Indian services, and we've opened up 103 for theirs. We're talking IT, professional services, education, healthcare, the whole shebang. Could really pump up our service exports and bring in some serious foreign investment.
Now, to make sure everyone's protected, in case a flood of imports suddenly threatens local businesses, the IA-ACTA has got these trade remedies. Specifically, there's a safeguard mechanism that lets either country hit the brakes temporarily if imports surge and start hurting domestic producers, like an economic safety net.
Right, got it. And what happens if trade disputes pop up? Well, they've thought of that too. The first step is always talking it out, trying to find common ground. If that doesn't work, they could bring in a three-person panel. Each country picks one, and then they agree on a third to head it up.
And if we zoom out and look at the bigger economic picture, the IA-ECTA has got some ambitious targets. They're shooting for bilateral trade to climb from $31 billion in 2021 to, get this, $40 to $50 billion within 5 years. India's also set some goals, aiming for 20 billion USD in exports by 2026-27, and then pushing it to 35 billion by 2035. If they hit those numbers, it'd be a huge boost to the economic partnership.
Important to remember for your exams that this IA-ECT is really just the first step. It's setting the stage for something even bigger. The Australia-India Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement, or AICTEC. Think of it as taking things to the next level, expanding beyond just goods and services to cover investment, intellectual property, and a whole lot more.
And this brings up a point we're thinking about. While the IA-ECTA is definitely good news, there's still some bumps in the road. Those AI-CKTA talks have been dragging on, which tells you it's not always easy to find common ground. And then there are the non-tariff barriers. Things like food safety standards, technical rules, those can still make trade a bit clunky. Oh, and there's this whole thing about how Australia sets prices for pharmaceuticals. That's causing some friction, too.
Okay, let's switch gears and talk about something a little different. The Green Credit Program, or GCP. The Prime Minister rolled this out at KECO 28 back in December 2023. The big idea here is to make it worthwhile for people to do things that are good for the environment and to back up the whole mission life concept.
The GCP works by giving out green credits for specific actions. Stuff like planting trees or managing waste. There are 7 areas they're focusing on. And here's the interesting part. You can trade these credits. Yep, they're tradable on a platform right here in India. Companies can even use them to meet their reforestation requirements or include them in their ESG reports, those environmental, social, and governance reports that are becoming a big deal in the corporate world.
And the folks over at the Indian Council of Forestry Research and Education, that's ICFRE, in Devardun, they're the ones running the show. One thing to note, if you're planning a big tree planting project under the GCP, each piece of land you use has to be at least 5 hectares. That's the minimum they're accepting.
Now, even though the goal here is good, this whole program has been getting a lot of side-eye and criticism. One of the big sticking points is whether it's even legal. Some folks are saying that the Environment Protection Act of 1986, the law they used to set up the GCP, doesn't actually say anything about using these green credits for reforestation projects. Makes you wonder if it'll hold up in court.
Yeah, that legal angle is something UPSC aspirants need to pay attention to when they're studying environmental regulations. And there are environmental concerns, too. Some people worry that companies might just buy these green credits instead of actually doing the hard work of restoring forests. If that happens, the whole point of increasing forest cover and helping the environment kind of goes out the window.
And then there's the whole focus on degraded lands. Using them for plantations seems like a good idea at first glance, but these lands often have their own ecosystems, even if they don't look like dense forests. Turning them into plantations with just one type of tree could actually harm whatever biodiversity exists there. Plus, it's not like we're adding to the total forest area, just changing what's already there.
Here's another wrinkle. Unlike regular compensatory afforestation, where you usually have to plant trees on land that wasn't forest before, the GCP lets you use existing degraded forest land to earn credits. So the argument is that maybe it's not really adding to the country's overall forest cover, which was the whole point, right?
Plus, it seems to clash with the Ven Sanrakshan Evam Varden Adhiniam, that law from 2023. That one's all about a land-for-land approach. If you take forest land for development, you have to reforest the same amount of non-forest land somewhere else. The GCP doesn't seem to play by those rules.
And there's the question of how they're actually going to judge whether this program is working and if it's sustainable over the long haul. Sources are saying there's no clear way to measure the success of these plantations, especially whether the trees actually survive. That's kind of a big deal, because what's the point of giving out credits if the trees just die off?
All right, let's shift focus to a core part of how our democracy functions, the anti-defection law. The Supreme Court just came down pretty hard on speakers for taking forever to decide on petitions to disqualify legislators under this law. They said that all this stalling can't be allowed to undermine the whole purpose of the 10th schedule of the Constitution.
The big question the Supreme Court was dealing with was whether constitutional courts can actually tell speakers, when they're acting like judges in these cases, to make a decision on those anti-defection petitions within a reasonable time frame. Can they force them to act?
And what the Supreme Court had to say is pretty significant, especially when it comes to understanding who has power in our system. First off, they made it clear that they're not just going to sit there if a speaker is dragging their feet. The judiciary has a responsibility to make sure the Constitution is working the way it should.
Second, they said that while they can't tell the speaker what the decision should be, that's the speaker's job, they can absolutely tell them to make a decision within a reasonable time. They even brought up a case from 2020, Kesha Megachandra Singh v. Speaker, Manipur Legislative Assembly, to back up that power.
They went even further, saying that if a speaker ignores a court order to decide within a specific time, the Supreme Court can use its special powers under Article 142 of the Constitution to make sure justice is served. They're not messing around.
It wasn't just about setting deadlines, though. The Supreme Court had a bunch of other things to say about how to make the anti-defection law work better. They reiterated the point they made back in the Quijota Holohan v. Zakilu case in 1992. Courts have the right to step in if a speaker is delaying things or handling a petition improperly.
They also stress the importance of the speaker being impartial. They referenced the Rabi S. Knight v. Union of India case from 1994 to emphasize that even though the speaker comes from a political party, they have to act like a neutral judge when deciding these disqualification cases. No playing favorites.
But maybe the most interesting suggestion they made was to seriously consider taking the power to decide these cases away from the speaker and giving it to a completely independent tribunal. That's a pretty big deal and reflects the worry that there's always a risk of bias when the person making the decision is also deeply involved in the political game.
Now, for those of you prepping for the UPSC, it's important to remember that the anti-defection law was introduced back in 1985 with the 52nd Amendment. It added the 10th schedule to the Constitution, the main goal: to stop politicians from jumping ship just for personal gain after they've been elected. It's about keeping things stable.
The law spells out exactly what can get you disqualified, mainly if you ditch your party or disobey your party's instructions on how to vote. That's the party whip, without getting permission first.
And as we've been discussing, the speaker is the one who acts like a judge when someone files a petition to disqualify a member under this law. The Supreme Court's comments are highlighting the ongoing debate about whether this is the best way to do things and if it's really fair.
Okay, let's move on to some recent developments in legislation. The Lok Sabha just passed the Waqf Amendment Bill 2025, and it brings some pretty significant changes to the existing Waqf Act of 1995.
The main goal of these changes seems to be to make managing Waqf properties smoother, give more power to the people involved in taking care of them, and simplify the whole process of surveying and registering them.
So getting into the specifics, the bill sets out some clear conditions for creating a Waqf. It says that only the person who legally owns a property can dedicate it as a Waqf. And for those Waqfs set up to benefit the founder's family, Waqf al-Awad, they can't mess with the inheritance rights of the legal heirs, and that includes women. Everyone's got rights.
Another big change is that all Waqfs have to be registered online. All the details about the property need to be on a specific website within 6 months of this bill becoming law. The Waqf Tribunal can give you more time if you need it, but online registration is a must.
They've also addressed the tricky issue of properties being wrongly declared as Waqf land. The bill says, flat out, that government property can't be Waqf property. And if there's a dispute about who owns a property that's claimed to be a Waqf, the state government will appoint someone to investigate and report back so they can sort it out.
To keep things transparent, the bill says that anyone who wants to can check the records for Waqf properties. They'll do it according to the rules in Section 75 of the Bharatiya Saksha Adhiniyam 2023, which is the new Indian Evidence Act.
They've also laid out the process for the government to acquire Waqf properties if they need them for public purposes. They have to follow the right to fair compensation and transparency in Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation, and Resettlement Act 2013 or any other relevant law on land acquisition. And importantly, they have to consult with the Waqf Board, so the Waqf's interests are considered.
The bill also changes the Central Waqf Council. The union minister who's in charge of Waqf affairs will automatically be the chairperson. The council can give directions to the state Waqf boards and can even act on its own without waiting for a complaint. And the council will include members of parliament, Supreme Court, and High Court judges, and other important stakeholders.
Now, if you're studying for the UPSC, you might remember that a Waqf is basically a charitable endowment under Islamic law. Someone dedicates property for religious or social purposes, mosques, schools, hospitals, orphanages, that sort of thing.
The whole history of Waqfs is fascinating. The concept comes from Arabic traditions and is connected to the hadiths, the sayings and practices of the Prophet Muhammad. How Waqf properties were managed in India changed over time. During the Delhi Sultanate and Mughal periods, they started setting up formal administrative structures. And it was really during the British era that the idea of a Waqf as a legally recognized institution became solid.
Oh, and one more thing to keep in mind. The Lok Sabha also approved the Mussalman Waqf Repeal Bill 2024, which gets rid of the 1923 Act. It's all part of making the laws about Waqfs in India more modern and streamlined.
Okay, let's talk about child adoption in India. The Union Minister of State for Women and Child Development said there are more than 30,000 people in India right now who've registered and are waiting to adopt a child. And get this, over 62,000 kids are living in child care institutions, CCIs, around the country.
Those numbers show you there are a lot of people who want to adopt and a lot of children who need homes. The Union Ministry of WCD is the main one in charge of child adoption. The big law here is the Juvenile Justice, Care, and Protection of Children Act, 2015. The most important thing is what's best for the child, keeping them safe, secure, and making sure they're treated with dignity and well cared for.
The Central Adoption Resource Authority, or CRA, is the main agency for regulating adoptions, both within India and from other countries. They're also the ones who make sure we follow the Hague Convention on Protection of Children and cooperation in respect of inter-country adoption. That agreement's all about making sure international adoptions are ethical and legal and preventing kids from being kidnapped or trafficked. India signed it back in 1993.
In each state and union territory, the State Adoption Resource Agencies, SARAs, the Child Welfare Committees, CWCs, in each district, and the District Child Protection Units, DCPUs, handle things on the ground. They help with the adoption process, check out the homes of people who want to adopt, and make sure everything's legal and done right.
Even with all the laws and agencies, there are still some tough challenges when it comes to child adoption in India. One big problem is all the bureaucratic red tape. People can end up waiting over a year to adopt, which is tough on everyone involved.
And sadly, there's still a bias against adopting older children or children with disabilities. Those kids are much less likely to be adopted than babies or toddlers without disabilities. It's really a reflection of how our society thinks, and we need to change that. We need to be more open to different kinds of families.
Absolutely. And some people still believe that biological children are better, which adds to the stigma around adoption. Many people who want to adopt prefer kids they think share their genes or bloodline. It makes it even harder to find homes for kids waiting to be adopted.
The good news is the government is trying to make things better. They've changed some laws recently, like the Juvenile Justice Amendment rules in 2022, which gives district magistrates more power to handle adoption cases. The idea is to make the process faster and less centralized.
And they've got this Carings website now, which has made things a lot more efficient and transparent. You can register, fill out all the forms, and track your application online, which cuts down on bureaucracy and potential for problems. They've also got the Mission Vatsalya scheme, which supports children in CCIs while they're waiting to be adopted or find another good place to live.
Let's talk about another big change in the law. Parliament just passed the Immigration and Foreigners Bill 2025. This is all about updating our immigration laws for the modern world, tightening security, and getting all the different agencies involved in immigration to work together better.
It's a pretty major overhaul, and they're actually getting rid of several old laws: the Passport Act of 1920, the Registration of Foreigners Act of 1939, the Foreigners Act of 1946, and the Immigration Carriers Liability Act of 2000. Combining all of that into one new law shows they're trying to simplify and streamline how we handle immigration.
A big part of the new bill is making sure immigration is regulated effectively. The Bureau of Immigration is now the main one in charge of visas and managing how people come into and leave India. Having one central authority should make things more efficient and secure.
And there are tougher penalties now for anyone who comes into India without the right papers. If you're caught without a valid passport or visa, you could be looking at up to 5 years in prison, a fine of up to 5 lakh rupees, or both. They're serious about making sure everyone who enters India does it legally.
They're also giving more power to law enforcement. Any police officer who's at least a head constable can now arrest someone without a warrant if they suspect they've broken the immigration laws.
Now let's talk about something interesting that any IOG is doing. They've created this thing called the Fiscal Health Index, or FHI, using financial data from the Comptroller and Auditor General of India for the fiscal year 2022-23.
The goal is to have a standard way to compare how financially healthy different states in India are. It's a more objective and data-driven way to see how well they're managing their money.
For now, they're including 18 major states, the ones that really drive the Indian economy. They're the big players when it comes to GDP, population, government spending, revenue, and overall financial stability.
They've broken the FHI down into a few key sub-indices, each looking at a different aspect of a state's finances. There's the quality of expenditure, which probably looks at how well states are using their money to get things done.
Then there's revenue mobilization, which checks how well states can raise their own money through things like taxes. That means they depend less on the central government. Fiscal prudence probably looks at how responsible states are with their budgets, how much they borrow, and whether they stick to their financial plans.
The debt index shows how much debt each state has, how much they owe. And the debt sustainability subindex assesses whether they'll be able to pay back those debts over time, considering things like how much their revenue grows and how much interest they have to pay. The FHI could be a useful tool for policymakers, researchers, and even for making states more accountable for how they manage their finances.
Let's take a moment to remember a key figure in Indian history, Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. April 3rd marked the 345th anniversary of his death. He passed away on April 3rd, 1680, at Raigad Fort. His story is one of resistance, resilience, and the birth of the Maratha Empire. Understanding his impact is crucial for UPSC prep, especially when you're studying Indian nationalism and regional powers.
Shivaji Maharaj was born in 1630 at Shivneri Fort, near Pune. He's known as the founder of the Maratha Empire in western India. The Marathas became a major power, challenging the Mughal Empire's control in the region.
A big turning point was his coronation as the Chhatrapati, the ruler, in 1674 at Raigad. That's when the independent Maratha state officially began, starting the Rajabhisheka era.
Shivaji Maharaj was more than just a warrior. He was a smart leader. He created the Ashtrapadhana, a council of 8 ministers to help him govern.
He also saw how important it was to have a strong navy. He started building the Maratha naval force in 1654 near Kalyan and set up fortified bases along the western coast. This protected his territories and gave him control over sea trade.
He was famous for his clever military tactics, especially guerrilla warfare. This allowed his forces to take on and often defeat much larger, more traditional armies. One of his early victories, the one against the Bijapur general Afzal Khan in 1659, showed just how bold and skilled he was.
Okay, let's talk about something that's super important today, the role of women in disaster risk reduction, or DRR. The Union Ministry of Women and Child Development did a study called How Does Climate Change Impact Women and Children Across Agroecological Zones in India? It highlights how we need data that specifically looks at the impact on women and children because they're often hit the hardest by climate change and disasters.
The study makes a key point. Climate change and disasters don't affect everyone equally. To be prepared and respond effectively, we need data that shows us how women and children are uniquely vulnerable. And that's why there's been a push to get women more involved in DRR.
A good example is the UPA scheme, which trains people to be first responders during disasters. They've made a real effort to include women, and almost 20% of the 1 lakh UPA volunteers are women. It shows they're ready and willing to play a vital role in disaster management at the community level.
There are also some really innovative initiatives popping up. Siwa in Ahmedabad has this microinsurance program specifically for women who work in informal sectors. It protects them financially during heat waves because they're often ones who can't work when it gets too hot. It recognizes that climate change impacts their income directly.
Some state governments are stepping up too. The Odisha State Disaster Management Authority, OSDMA, has a special gender cell that collects data about how disasters and extreme weather affect women. That data is super important for figuring out how to help them and making sure their needs are addressed in all stages of disaster management, preparing, responding, and recovering.
All right, time to talk about some economic policy changes. India just updated its steel procurement policy. It's called the Domestically Manufactured Iron and Steel Products Policy 2025. The main idea is to give preference to steel made in India for government contracts, which should be a boost for Indian manufacturers.
It also adds this idea of reciprocity, probably to encourage other countries to drop their trade restrictions on Indian steel. And they're requiring that capital goods used to make steel in India have a certain percentage of domestic value added.
One of the main changes is that for government projects that cost up to Rs 200 crore, they can't issue global tender inquiries, GTEs, for steel anymore. They have to buy Indian steel unless they get special permission. It's a clear signal that they want to support Indian steelmakers, at least for smaller projects.
And for those big pieces of equipment they use in the steel industry, like blast furnaces and rolling mills, they now need to have at least 50% of their value added domestically. This should encourage companies to make that stuff here in India instead of importing it.
Okay, this one's a little out of left field. The U.S. president recently said they're putting a 10% tariff on imports from several countries. And get this, Heard and McDonald Island is on the list.
Yeah, it was a bit of a head-scratcher. He made the announcement on April 2nd, which he called Liberation Day, saying it was a really important day in U.S. history. But it's not clear why Heard and McDonald Island are involved or what it has to do with that date.
For anyone who's not up on their geography, Heard Island and McDonald Islands are way down in the Southern Ocean. They're super remote, nobody lives there, but they're officially Australian territory.
What's cool about these islands is that they're the only volcanically active subantarctic islands in the world. Scientists love them because they can study geological processes in glaciers in a completely untouched environment. And they're also UNESCO World Heritage Sites, which tells you how important they are ecologically and geologically.
In some less positive news, a U.S. citizen was just arrested in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands for allegedly going into the restricted tribal area on North Sentinel Island. It's a reminder of how crucial it is to protect the people who live there.
North Sentinel Island is part of the Andamans, and it's home to the Sentinelese people. They're considered one of the last uncontacted tribes on Earth. They've been isolated for centuries, and Indian law is really strict about protecting their way of life.
The Sentinelese are classified as a particularly vulnerable tribal group, or PVTG. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands have a few other PVTGs too, each with their own unique culture: the Great Andamanese, the Jarawas, the Onges, and the Shompens. These communities are especially vulnerable to outside influences.
That's why, way back in 1956, the government enacted the Andaman and Nicobar Islands Protection of Aboriginal Tribes Regulation. It declared the areas where these tribes live as reserved, and you can't go there without permission. You're also not allowed to take pictures or videos of them without their consent. It's all about respecting their privacy and keeping them safe.
Switching gears to public health, there's talk of using the National Polio Surveillance Project, or NPSP, for more than just polio. The Ministry of Health and Family Welfare is thinking of adapting it to track other infectious diseases as well.
The NPSP is a joint effort between the Indian government and the WHO. It was set up in 1997 to create a system to track cases of acute flaccid paralysis, or AFP, which can be a sign of polio.
The NPSP was absolutely essential in getting rid of polio in India. The surveillance system helped them plan and monitor all those huge immunization campaigns, making sure they reached everyone. That's why India was declared polio-free by the WHO in 2014, a huge win for public health.
The NPSP has this amazing network of trained people and tons of expertise in epidemiology, so it makes sense to use it to track other emerging diseases. It's a smart way to use what we already have to improve our disease surveillance and be ready for new health threats. And by the way, in 2025, they integrated the polio surveillance part of the NPSP into the National Center for Disease Control, NCDC, under the Integrated Disease Surveillance Program, IDSP, so they're really streamlining things.
And finally, for all you history buffs out there, some rare copper plates were just found in Bengaluru. They document the coronation of Devaraya I, a ruler of the Vijayanagara Empire. They're written in Sanskrit in Canada, using the Nagari script.
Devaraya ruled from 1406 to 1422 during the Sangama period. He was a big builder. He even built a dam across the Tungabhadra River to create an irrigation system with canals that brought water to cities and farms that really helped the empire thrive.
It's also cool to remember that an Italian traveler named Nicola de Conti visited Vijayanagara in 1420 during Devaraya III's reign. He wrote about what an amazing and prosperous city it was, with incredible architecture and a booming economy. He gives you a real sense of how impressive the Vijayanagara Empire was back then.
And that wraps up our deep dive into these important current affairs for April 4th, 2025, Part 2. Hope this helps you as you keep studying for the UPSC exams.
It's incredible how all these different topics, global trade, environmental protection, legal decisions, historical discoveries, they all come together to shape the India we're studying and getting ready to serve.
Here's something to ponder as you continue your UPSC journey with all this interconnectedness we've seen today through trade agreements, information flow, and global health initiatives. What can individual citizens do to understand and participate in these complex global dynamics? It's worth thinking about what your role and responsibilities will be.
That's a great point to end on. Keep that in mind as you study. And if you found this deep dive helpful for your UPSC prep, please hit that like button and subscribe to the deep dive for more content designed to help you succeed.